As I was going through the information overload that is the war in Ukraine, I noticed a certain topic is missing. A topic that is essential when it comes to every war: peace. So in this video, I will try to cover this part, and not from an ideological standpoint that aggressor must always lose, but from a realistic analysis, looking at history. Ukraine's recent counteroffensive success in Kharkiv and Kherson region has raised hopes that a larger rollback of Russian troops is at hand. But this remains a daunting task. Russia continues to occupy roughly 1/5 of the land of Ukraine. However, Ukraine is ever more confident on the battlefield victory. Russia, on the other hand, has called up its reserves. Both sides are eyeing for a larger, bloodier times ahead. This raises a question: is peace even possible? Most wars ends in deals, and diplomacy is how you get there. As winter bites, we should expect to see more voices safely far away from the battlefield suggesting that it is time to talk about peace. Such voices can be heard now in the western capitals, slowly and carefully nudging Ukraine towards negotiated settlement. However, victory, not peace, is the priority of Ukrainian leadership, with President Volodymyr Zelensky declaring that Ukraine will not give up any of its territory to end the war, and is adamant on taking back all of the land including Crimea. But a time will come when peace will have to be made, and any agreement will need to be accepted not only by Ukraine and Russia, but by a larger international community who will act as its guarantor. But is peace even possible? Is Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin willing to negotiate? And how would a road to peace look like? Zelensky has demanded a full withdrawal of Russian troops from its territory, payment for the war damages, and punishment for the war crimes committed by Russian troops. Zelensky has personally signed a directive that categorically forbids him to speaking with Putin. This practically implied that the Kiev official stance is a change in government in Russia as a prerequisite for talks. The Ukrainian army has taken the initiative on the front lines and has liberated large portions of Ukrainian land. So from their perspective, negotiations are a mean for Russia to buy time. It is evident from Ukraine's standpoint that they will not accept any peace as of now unless all the regions lost since the invasion in February are returned. The ultimate goal of Ukraine is evident and clear. It wants all the territory back from Russia. However, understanding Russian goals is essential to determining whether peace can be achieved or not. Vladimir Putin entered Ukraine with many goals in mind. He wanted to intimidate Ukraine into submission and secure its future as a client state, much like Belarus. Before the war, Putin made contradictory and sometimes impossible to meet demands. Some of these demands were a legally binding recognition that Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO. This demand was ultimately rejected by US as it claims to have an open door policy for all the aspiring members. A limit to the deployment of troops and Western weapons into the NATO eastern flank. This was also rejected by US as this would have taken NATO back to the 1997 borders, something that is impossible for Baltic and NATO eastern flank to accept. A third demand was denazification of Ukraine. Ukraine does suffer a far-right fringe, including the neo-Nazi-linked group Azov Battalion, who became famous for the defense of Mariupol. However, the neo-Nazi threat in Ukraine is minimal, as evident by their electoral victories. Another demand by Russian president was an acceptance of Donbas as a sovereign territory. President Putin wanted to implement Minsk II Accords, which would have given Donbas significant autonomy in Ukraine and subsequently control over the central government. And the final goal was acceptance of Crimea as a legitimate part of Russia. For its part, Moscow has long since abandoned its initial goals of toppling the Ukrainian government and rolling back NATO borders to 1997, and has said that it is open to negotiate without any preconditions. To understand the Moscow's bottom line for Ukraine, we need to look at the only other invasion Putin has undertaken during his decade-long rule over Russia. Russia invaded Georgia in 2008 under similar circumstances. Georgia was eyeing for NATO membership after Bucharest Conference. A similar stalemate to Donbas developed in the region of Abkhazia, where Abkhaz separatist has waged a war with Georgia for decades. Following the election of Vladimir Putin in Russia in 2000 and a pro-Western change of government in Georgia in 2003, relations between Russia and Georgia began to deteriorate, reaching a full diplomatic crisis by April 2008. On 1st August 2008, the Russian-backed South Ossetian forces started shelling the Georgian villages. To put an end to these, Georgian army units were sent into South Ossetian conflict zone on 7th August. In response, the Russian troops crossed the international border and advanced into the South Ossetian conflict zone. Russia accused Georgia of committing genocide and aggression against South Ossetia. It launched a full-scale land, air and sea invasion of Georgia, including its undisputed territories. Russia and South Ossetian forces fought Georgian forces in and around South Ossetia for several days until Georgian forces retreated. Russia and Abkhaz forces opened a second front and Russian naval forces blockaded the Georgian Black Sea coastline. The Russian Air Force attacked numerous targets within and beyond the conflict zone. A negotiated settlement was quickly reached on 12th of August and Russia completed its withdrawal by 8th of October. Russia did not install a puppet government in Tbilisi, and the pre-war President Mikhail goes on to complete his 5-year term till 2012. Russia withdrew from all the undisputed regions, and conflict resulted in Georgia giving up its aspirations for NATO membership, and the rights of the separatists in Georgia was ensured as an unrecognized autonomous zone was created. So for Ukraine, Russia's bottom line goal before going into the war is also similar, bringing Ukraine to heel with immense pressure, where Zelensky government will be forced to accept Russia's demand of neutrality and acceptance of Donbass as an autonomous region and Crimea as former part of Russia. This is the absolute baseline for Russia and for Putin to claim some sort of victory inside Ukraine. However, it would be right to say that after the loss of thousands of soldiers, the battlefield objectives have changed, and Russia would not settle for anything less than incorporation of the southern Ukraine. So there is obviously a mismatch between the two warring parties, and to find a common ground is not possible in the current situation. Russia has recently announced a partial mobilization and 300,000 soldiers have yet to join the battlefield, and Ukraine has recently gained strategic victories in Kharkiv and Kherson. Therefore, both parties still believe a victory on the battlefield is possible, and only after achieving battlefield goals, the parties will move to the negotiating table. But is this even a realistic assessment? Ukraine so far has not exhausted its offensive potential. However, with all of the military and the financial support it is getting from the Western allies, it is still doubtful it can sustain the war of attrition with its more powerful neighbor in the long run. For Russia, especially for Mr. Putin, the war is about survival. Not for the survival of Russia as a state, but for the survival of Russian regime. Therefore, his appetite for a long war is greater than for the parties in the West, who are essential for Ukraine victory. Ukraine is expected to lose more than 35% of GDP, and this is after it is being supplied by almost 100 billion euros this year. This is especially troublesome for Ukraine as it was one of the poorest regions of Europe and have a GDP per capita of half of Belarus even before the war. To sustain, Ukraine requires $3 to $4 billion per month just to run its government. This is on top of all the military aid that it needs. And with Russia putting more strain on the civilian infrastructure, the number will only go up. Zelensky reportedly acknowledged that up to 40% of the country's energy infrastructure have been destroyed by Russia. In contrast, Russia will see its economy shrink by only 3.5% this year and 2.3% next year. And by 2024, Russia will already have recovered and will be growing at 1.5%. The majority of the 300,000 men that Russia claims to have mobilized have not yet been deployed. In addition, it is increasing its own production while acquiring more drones and highly accurate missiles from Iran. It is cautiously resuming offensive in the Donetsk region while leaving Kherson. The best opportunity for Ukraine to advance in peace negotiation arises when it is on the winning side. Russia's desire for political and territorial trophies will increase tremendously if it once again gains the upper hand on the front lines. Russia's organized withdrawal from Kherson and Washington's subsequent insistence on possibility of talks raises a question on what a peace negotiation would look like. Russian territorial claims goes beyond Donetsk and Luhansk region. Russia also formally annexed the regions of Zaporozhye and Kherson. Although it gave itself some leeway by not defining their boundaries, Moscow still has control over majority of the Kherson region despite leaving the city of Kherson. Putin only needs to hold on to the land it has already controlled to declare victory. He even has room for a greater losses. The conformist majority in Russia has never expressed a real desire for territorial growth or concerns over which portion of Ukraine territory the nation will govern after the peace is restored. Instead of an imperialistic territorial grab, Putin's campaign in Ukraine is more of a punitive operation. Putin will feel vindicated as long as the end of conflict is more humiliating for Ukraine than the fulfillment of Minsk agreements. On the other side, Zelensky is on a mission to live up to the maximalistic aspirations, while also dealing with a hostile opposition that is watching his every move and is prepared to accuse him of betraying Ukraine interest if he even discusses the possibility of negotiations. He must demonstrate that by resisting Russian pressure to implement the Minsk agreements, the huge sacrifice made by Ukraine was not in vain, and they actually are winning. Therefore, Kiev is attempting to regain as much ground as it can while maintaining its momentum. The trick is determining when to draw a line and sue for peace. What then might be the scenario to stop this war in Ukraine to guarantee the survival of Ukraine and also nullifies any risk of nuclear escalation or turning Ukraine into another Syria? In this video, I will give a modern day example for such a nation which compromised on its territorial integrity and is now much wealthier than its aggressor. And we will also discuss a likelihood of a peace deal. The Winter War was a war between Soviet Union and Finland. The war began with a Soviet invasion of Finland in November 1939 and ended 3.5 months later with the Moscow Peace Treaty in March 1940. Despite superior military strength, especially in tanks and aircrafts, the Soviet Union suffered severe losses and initially made little headway. The League of Nations, an organization similar to UNO, deemed the attack illegal and expelled Soviet Union from the organization. The onset of the war was because Stalin demanded some of the land from Finland. The St. Petersburg was only 32 kilometers from Finnish border, and this was too close for Stalin's liking. When Finland refused, Soviet Union invaded. Finland repelled the attack of Soviet and for more than 2.5 months inflicted heavy losses on Soviet Union. Soviet lost more than 4 times than the Finns. However, in a war of attrition, Soviets have the capability of fielding more men and putting more hardware. Hostilities ceased in March 1940 with the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty, in which Finland ceded 9% of its territory to the Soviet Union. Soviet gains exceeded its pre-war demands. However, Finland retained its sovereignty and enhanced its international reputation. Finland decided to cede the territory and focused on nation building, resulting in a lasting peace following the conclusion of World War II. Finland remained neutral during much of Cold War and is now 4 times richer than Russia. Is Ukrainian leadership and its people willing for such a possibility to end the war and build a nation that is free from such geopolitical chess games? A recent nationwide poll released underlined the current mood of defiance across the country. Conducted in October by Kiev International Institute of Sociology, the survey found that 86% of the Ukrainians support the continuation of the military offensive and rejected any negotiation despite the escalation of airstrikes against civilian infrastructure. Therefore, it is safe to say that the Ukrainian morale is high and the appetite for resistance is strong. However, for any war to end, a peace deal has to be signed. Although Ukraine's military objectives are morally and legally justified, they may not be wise. In reaction to the recent Ukrainian successes, Putin has increased its efforts rather than decreasing them. The US would need to reckon that if the defense of Ukraine is not worth the American troops on the ground, is returning all of the Donbas and Crimea to Ukrainian control worth the risk of starting a global conflict? In Ukraine, Russia has already suffered a significant strategic setback, if not a total one. Kiev and NATO allies are obviously tempted to strive to defeat Russia and re-establish Ukraine's complete integrity, given the progress made by Ukraine on the battlefield. However, Putin's attempt to dominate Ukraine has already been unsuccessful, and calling for Russia's complete defeat is a gamble that is too dangerous to take. The West must facilitate a diplomatic effort to end the conflict and reach a territorial settlement between Ukraine and Russia as soon as possible. A hypothetical deal between Russia and Ukraine would have 3 components. First, Ukraine would abandon its desire to join NATO. Ukraine would formally adopt a neutral status, but it would continue to receive financial support from the West and move towards EU membership. Earlier in the war, Mr. Zelensky himself suggested that Ukraine neutrality could be part of the peace deal. Second and much harder part is that Moscow and Kiev have to arrive at a territorial settlement. A reasonable starting point for the negotiations would be a complete ceasefire along the whole line of contact and the opening of the shipping lanes in the Black Sea. Diplomacy could then focus on the ultimate disposition of Crimea and Donbas. Diplomats can surely be creative in an effort to find peace. Maybe a designation of a region controlled by Russia as an international zone where the residents are free to choose between either Russia or Ukraine passports. Another solution could be an implementation of a peace agreement in the style of the Dayton Accords. This will ensure Ukraine's territorial integrity but will leave a weak central government, as the case with Bosnia. As for the question of Crimea, there is no possibility that Russia will ever surrender Crimea, and hence will be willing to go on an all-out war to defend the little peninsula. Therefore, any negotiation will happen on the question of Ukraine proper. A third part of the agreement would be an end to the sanctions against Russia, an unfreezing of international assets including Russian foreign exchange reserves. This would ensure that Russia has enough incentive to end the war and not pursue any more territorial ambitions in Ukraine. In conclusion, the compromise on both sides would be necessary for peace to exist. Russian goal at the start of the war to make Ukraine its client state has obviously failed, but Ukraine's maximalistic objectives cannot be implemented without a significant risk of escalation. Russian goals have significantly changed after the loss of thousands of troops in the battlefield. Russia will now look towards more territory inside Ukraine. Ukraine, on the other hand, can take a lesson from the history and follow Finland's example when it established its dominance over Soviet Union in the Winter War, but still gave up its territory to ensure a peaceful future that is more aligned to the Western ideals of liberty and freedom, and achieved prosperity over time and is now significantly richer than Russia itself. Transitioning from war to diplomacy offers hopes for stopping the killing and destruction, containing the growing risk of wider war between Russia and NATO, and reducing harm to the global economy. Even though such negotiations might fail to quickly produce a peace deal, but all parties should try nevertheless. As John F. Kennedy once said, above all, nuclear powers must avoid confrontation that force an adversary to choose between a humiliating retreat and a nuclear war.
If you like this video, please like, subscribe and share, as this would help and motivate me to make more content. Thank you and have a good day.